So in this lesson, we're going to open a file and write to it. Notice I said open the file. You will find this true not only in Python, but probably every programming language you ever encounter. There is at least a two-step process. It's actually a three-step process. You have to open the file, which returns a file object. You then use the file object to manipulate the file by writing or reading to it. And then finally, I close the file. Why this three-step process? If you've any programming background at all, you're probably already familiar with this. But otherwise, this is just what you have to do, and it's very practical because the step of opening a file allows you to specify a file name of any length. It can include a path name. You then tell it the mode. All that gets set up. You then get the file object, and all that stuff of finding the file on the disk is already done, taken care of. I then just concentrate on manipulating the file object to read or write, and I can do that as long as I want. I finally close the file object, which then frees up the file for other programs and other processes, and I'm done. And that's just the basic way you do things in Python or any other language. I open, I perform all the reading and writing I want, and finally I close. And Python provides you an open function to open a file. You get a file object, which you, again, assign to any variable name you want. And I use that same variable name to read and write, and finally to close the file, allowing other applications to access that file. Now, if you look at the arguments to the open function, the first is a string called file name. So I'm actually passing it a string, which will contain a name. This can be a complete path name, or it can default to the current directory. And then the second argument, which is also required, will be a string containing either W or R plus, W plus, A, or A plus. We're going to stick with W and R, which are just simple text file write and text file read. And by the way, any of these different modes, I can add B to do binary operations. We're going to assume text file operations throughout this entire lesson in the next one. So don't worry about binary for now, although we will discuss it briefly. Basically, for now, you want an R or a W. The R plus and W plus modes, though, do open the possibility of read-write modes. So if you want, a more advanced approach is to open a file for both reading and writing. But we're going to do just simple reading and writing for now. But let's discuss text versus binary mode before we move on, because if you spend enough time with Python, you will actually do both at some point, especially if you use it professionally. Text mode is the simplest way to manipulate a file for the most part. And a text file is easy to manipulate because we're just looking at it as a series of printable characters. So there's nothing fancy in terms of figuring out what the format is. The format is a series of strings, or you think of it as one big long string. There is no really internal organization to text mode file except that you have the occasional new lines. So if you print a text file, you can get a series of lines, and at the end of each of the strings is a /n, which means a new line. It just means we start a new physical line there. And that's the only organization in a text file, by the way. Binary mode is something else entirely, and binary mode is still important. Sophisticated applications like Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel, they use binary files. All kinds of advanced applications use binary files. But the problem with binary mode is that a binary file can have any number of kinds of sophisticated ways of organizing themselves. You cannot access a binary file without understanding its internal format. And the number of internal formats is unlimited, and it would be very difficult to cover that adequately in this course. However, it might be interesting to know that Python provides its own simplified ways of dealing with binary files. For example, there's something called the pickle package, which is an extremely easy way to read and write binary files using Python. However, it only works with Python. It's not compatible with any other binary formats. That might be something you might want to look into on your own. If you really want to do binary reading and writing, there's this pickle package, which is incredibly easy to use. But for right now, we'll stick with reading and writing text files, and most of the principles are the same, because again, you have to open, you do your reading and writing, and then you close. So it's still very similar. Now, how do we write to a text file? Well, we already know how to open a file, as I showed before, and we'll see an example. Basically, to write to a text file, you get the file object and you use the write method. So we take the name of the file object, whatever you gave it, go .write, and we give an argument which is a text string, and it simply writes that string to the file. It's that simple. The only twist here is that if you want to write it as a complete line of text, you will need to concatenate a new line character yourself. So let's demonstrate this. I've come up with a little program here that will open a file called stuff.txt, stuff.text. Open it for writing. And what it will do is it simply will prompt me over and over again for a line of text, and after I type in a line of text, it will simply write it to the file. Then it will close it. Okay, so let's implement this program. I'm going to use a file object named f. That's very simple. We're going to open a file for writing called stuff.txt. By the way, when I open a file for writing, it doesn't have to already exist. It will create the file if it doesn't exist. If a file does exist, then this is a little tricky because it will erase the contents that are already there. If I wanted to preserve the contents and do read write, I'd go W+. But we're going to just create this file from scratch. Now we go into an infinite loop again, but it's not truly infinite. When I say while true, I'm setting up a loop that would be infinite, except that it will allow us to break in the middle because I'm going to use the break keyword once again. And what I'm going to do in this loop is input a line of text from the end user. So that prompts the user for text with enter. And whatever they enter will be stored in the variable called s. Now, once again, let me try to explain this clearly. When I say if not s, what I'm saying is if s has 0 length. If s has 0 length, it will execute this next statement, which is a break. So if the end user enters an empty string, I'm done, break out of the loop. If we're still in this loop because the end user entered some actual text, I'm going to write out that string, and I'm going to append a new line. Let's go back. I didn't mean that new line myself. That was a real new line. I'm going to append the /n so that it's a complete line of text. It will end with a new line character which says new line. We'll do a new line at the end of this. And that's all for my loop. And after that loop is done, I will enter to be or not to be that. By the way, it wrote a 20 to the screen because that showed the number of characters that it wrote, but that doesn't go into the file. So to be or not to be, that will be written to the file. That is the question, is it not? Okay, now I'm going to enter an empty string, and that should break this loop because that's how I designed the loop. It did. Okay, now it broke the loop. Beautiful. So now the last thing I have to do is to say f.close. And what it will do when I say f.close is to write out that line of text, close the file, and free up the file so everyone else can look at it or do things. And when I close, by the way, it will empty something called the input buffer. It will finish will make sure all the I/O operations are complete, and then I can move on knowing that all the writes have actually been sent out to the file. So we're about to move on to a demo of reading what we just wrote. But before we do, I want to mention that the result of this, you couldn't see it on the screen, but you will see it. The result of all these operations was actually to create a text file and write some text to it. So when we move on to the next part of this lesson, we will be able to read that file and see that all that beautiful poetry actually was written out.